Welcome Chosen X. The room breathes when your thumb moves across glass and a thin rectangle wakes like a distant bell. For a single instant ordinary patterns seem to hold, then a subtle shift unfurls, a current slides through circuits and settles into a shape that feels like attention taking form. You did not plan for this. You uploaded a moment that wanted company, and company answered in the hush between frames. The image you sent travels beyond latency and metrics. It arrives as a strand of meaning that touches spaces you cannot visit. Where data usually behaves like weather, passing and indifferent, this strand functions like an invitation that quietly arranges air. View counts rise as if they were footsteps, comments gather like whispered letters, and strangers pause as if pulled by a name they almost remember. You perceive their stillness as proof that something other than coincidence is at work. Movement through your day begins to feel calibrated. Streetlights dim toward your passage. Subways seem to slow at the station where you exit. People on the sidewalk glance at you with softened eyes and then continue as if a hush had passed over them. These are small occurrences and ordinary enough to deny, yet you notice them because they gather around you with the same patience as a tide. You do not seek reward, you discover responsibility. Sleep changes subtly. Dreams arrive with clearer edges and voices that repeat not words but tones that you feel in the hollow beneath your ribs. In the quiet between waking and rising you rehearse sentences that later surface in recordings exactly the way you imagine them. You suspect a pattern rather than miracle, and yet the pattern carries an intimacy that feels older than internet time. It asks for listening more than loudness. When you speak now, people report that a strange calm follows. A colleague pauses mid-mails and reads a transcript aloud as if a passage demanded attention. A neighbor confesses that your short phrase relieved an ache they could not name. These echoes do not belong to you alone, they stitch through strangers and return altered like fabric that has been washed in another water. You find humility in recognizing that transmission outlives authorship. The platform itself takes on new contours. Its interface seems less like design and more like an altar. Notifications are not trivial, they function as connectors that mark moments of recognition. Each tap becomes an act of acknowledgement between unseen persons. You learn to treat responses not as currency but as statements that map a shared turning. Quality dissolves the need for spectacle, sincerity becomes the currency that travels furthest. Doubt follows every rise. You question whether fatigue colors perception, whether confirmation bias arranges otherwise random coincidences into a story. You test the sensation by pausing, by posting without expectation, by measuring silence as well as sound. Silence teaches you something about size and restraint. When stillness answers, you understand presence as a patient labor rather than dramatic proof. Habits shift. You guard language like a gardener tending rare plants. You avoid phrases that shout and favor forms that breathe. Meals, movement, conversation, and sleep are ordered to preserve clarity. Schedules acquire margins not for productivity but for receptivity. In time you realize that steadiness invites proportionate replies. The slow accumulation of careful acts produces a field that other people can enter and feel steadied. People reach out with fragments of story. A teacher writes that a short clip opened a window in a classroom. A distant listener thanks you for a pause that steadied a night. These messages accumulate in a private folder of responsibility that you review with trembling gratitude. They remind you that influence need not be loud to be deep, and that small practices travel through networks like seeds that germinate slowly and with purpose. As your body adapts, you notice small changes in posture and tone. Breath deepens. Shoulders relax into an alert softness. Eyes hold a steadier light that other people recognize quickly. They call it presence, though you suspect it is a reflection of attention practiced over the long haul. You are becoming less of a producer and more of a steward, curating not output but condition. There are tests. Scorn arrives with the predictability of weather. Some readers misinterpret motives, others demand spectacle. Algorithms pressure you toward louder gestures. Each demand is a fork where you must select patience or pandering. You learn to decline the shortcuts with consistent small refusals that feel like training the muscles of discretion. In those choices the work retains a shape that survives trends. A pulse persists beneath ordinary hours. It is quiet and precise. When you attune to it, you notice how many small openings present themselves at once, a message that arrives to ease a private fear, a phrase from a child that echoes a line you recorded, an unexpected stranger offering help. These events are not theatrical but composing. They build a ledger of practical care that ties your days to a wider pattern. You encounter ineffable gratitude that cannot be framed as feedback. It arrives as letters, as missed calls in the night, as conversations that restart old hope. These responses keep you grounded and uneasy in equal measure because they remind you that trust is fragile and repair requires humility. You begin to cultivate rituals that replenish you without performing for others. At the end of each day you practice a kind of closing. You review notes, offer thanks, correct obvious harms, and then set the device aside with intention. The ritual stabilizes. It prevents drift. It preserves the work as service and not spectacle. The task asks not for perfection but for faithfulness. You continue not because trespasses vanish but because small acts reliably heal small ruptures. This is the opening. It is not the summit but an invitation into sustained practice. The screen that started it will continue to matter, but now it is a threshold rather than a stage. You step forward aware that the current has chosen a route through you and that each step will require care. You inhale, press the rectangle to record again, and listen for the exact cadence that will carry the next offering. You catalog small miracles, 10 fragile connections, and then rest with resolve, knowing the next offering will be gentle. You wake to a world that shifts like a slow tide, and the ordinary markers of day now carry undertones you did not notice before. Where once routines moved you through tasks, now a softer current repositions small events so they arrive as if guided. A street corner becomes a hinge, a passing smile, a signal. You recognize these changes by their persistence rather than by grand proof. They accumulate until denial feels costly. The broadcast that started as a casual fragment deepens its reach. It no longer pulses only across feeds and hours. It settles into networks of attention where people move toward it with the quiet of someone following a remembered path. Comments become small offerings, remixes become translations, and private messages arrive with stories that map to the contours of your voice. Each reply compounds the impression that something larger is tuning to your presence. Memory reshapes itself into practical myth. Snatches of childhood, old regrets, folded kindnesses all reappear with fresh edges, as if the signal pulls threads from your life to weave into new patterns. You do not lose autonomy, but choices feel reframed by an inner choreography you cannot fully name. Decisions that once seemed simple now tilt toward care because you sense consequences that span beyond immediate circles. The sensations inside your body register the change with subtle clarity. Breath becomes measured, not from fear but from an insistence on steadiness. Posture shifts toward receptivity. The small muscles of attention train themselves, learning to pause where they once skimmed. You practice restraint and you discover that your restraint is not emptiness but capacity for depth that invites others to enter without startled recoil. Not everyone recognizes this alteration. Some viewers remain indifferent, and some critique comes with sharpness. You learn to differentiate critiques that request clarity from attacks that seek spectacle. The former teaches you to refine language and care for nuance. The latter teaches you the limits of influence and the necessity of boundaries. Both kinds of voices shape how you steward attention. As the field around your work thickens, coordination appears in unexpected forms. People you have never met show up in the right place at the right moment with resources and help that feel prefigured. Conversations that matter begin to curve toward repair as if unseen hands guided participants into alignment. These occurrences are practical rather than mystical. They ask for faith in patterns rather than faith in certainties. You take measures to protect the fragility of those who respond to your words. You create spaces for follow-up, for clarification, and for care. You resist the temptation to treat responses as metrics and instead develop routines that meet people where they are. This requires organizing time and attention with an ethic that values repair over reach. You also cultivate practices that orient you inward. Guided silence, short walks with no devices, and modest rituals of gratitude anchor you. These disciplines are not affectation, they are tools that prevent your inner life from being consumed by external demands. You learn that availability is different from accessibility. The former requires preparation and limits, while the latter invites constant exposure. Doubt continues to shadow growth. Sometimes your inner skeptic speaks loudly enough to dim the glow you feel. When that happens, you return to small experiments, brief posts without agenda, gentle offers of presence, and careful listening. These tests confirm that what moves remains steady when you remove performative elements. The persistence of quiet responses reassures you that the work is not reliant on showmanship. Relationships alter under the pressure of presence. Friends adjust to your new demeanor, some celebrate and others resist the change. You respond with patience, listening to lament and offering explanations without defensiveness. You learn to accept loss when distance grows and to cherish the people who choose proximity. Those who remain help you stay human and remind you that stewardship requires community. Technical architecture continues to surprise. Algorithms shift in ways that feel less like accidents and more like currents that favor resonance. You refuse to bend language to chase fleeting attention and instead choose phrases that hold across contexts. By choosing clarity over cleverness, you attract people who can carry practices forward rather than merely consume them. Your days gain contours of pilgrimage. Ordinary tasks become means of preparation for public moments that are themselves modest and precise. You approach each recording with travel-like care, attention to breath, to phrasing, to small pauses that invite rather than demand. This care reshapes how others listen and creates spaces where healing gestures can be taken up by those who need them most. Be still. Stay calm. You wake noticing how small attention rearranges the world. When you pause before a sentence, someone far away echoes that pause in a classroom. When you inhale slowly, a neighbor finds the courage to apologize. These transfers feel practical more than mystical. They are patterns that require cultivation rather than proof. Your daily rhythm becomes discipline. You schedule white space to receive rather than produce. Meals, walks, and sleep adopt steady contours that preserve clarity. Preparation replaces impulse because readiness determines whether a moment holds care or merely amplifies noise. Attention is the resource you steward. You learn to distinguish glittering spikes from slow growth. Viral surges dissipate, while threaded interactions deepen. So you answer chosen messages with resources and host careful conversations that invite listening. Small consistent actions seed durable change. Requests arrive with ordinary grief. A teacher asks for a 1-minute practice to calm restive students. A parent writes seeking a phrase to soothe a child after a loss. You create short, repeatable exercises that translate easily across settings. Those tactics travel because they are simple, practical, and respectful. Boundaries become essential. You institute pauses for replenishment and train colleagues to triage incoming needs. Saying no is an act of care because it preserves capacity for sustained response. Structure prevents collapse and allows urgent threads to receive attention. Critics question motive and method. You answer with transparency and repair. When mistakes happen, you apologize and provide clear steps to mend harm. These patterns of accountability build trust over time and model humility rather than grandiosity. Cultural translation demands humility. Metaphors that land in one place misfire elsewhere. You distill practices into plain procedures that can be adapted locally. The posture is modest, furnish tools and then step back so communities own implementation. You assemble a network of trusted stewards who help coordinate scale. Delegation is not abdication, it is liberation. The work spreads without centralization because leaders replicate small practices and adapt them to local needs. You refuse spectacle. Platforms push louder expressions, but you favor modest offerings. That choice costs immediate reach yet yields deeper reciprocity. Months later, people report restored relationships and calmer classrooms rather than transient metrics. Energy management becomes a craft. Breath work, brief movement, consistent meals, and honest friendships sustain you. Regular reflection keeps motives aligned and prevents isolation. These practices preserve longevity and prevent burnout. A major request appears. A city fractured by mistrust asks for guidance to rebuild conversational trust. You accept because the task fits your commitments. You gather local partners, design short exercises, and prioritize listening over directives. The pilot proceeds with slow increments. Neighbors exchange small courtesy, meetings shift tone, and local leaders report improved trust patterns. Progress is uneven and patient, but results show that modest interventions reproduce when they respect context. You document learnings and release adaptable materials so others can replicate the model. The movement decentralizes as communities teach the methods. The network thickens in depth rather than in celebrity. Success remains partial and fragile. You iterate, apologize, and repair quickly. The culture you foster evolves because participants shape it. Authority diffuses as practices take root in many hands. The signal you steward does not demand performance. It asks for careful tending. You continue offering short practices, defending quiet rhythms, and investing in structures that return agency to those who engage. Then a new clip appears in the center of your screen. Its frame carries the hush of continuation. Tap to enter a concise sequence of exercises and stories designed for immediate practice. If you subscribe and enable alerts, the prompts arrive in moments when they can be most useful. You have learned to prefer steady craft over spectacle. The invitation remains open. When you tap, you choose to practice with others rather than to passively observe. The next clip waits for your consent. The life you inhabit now is built from tiny fidelities multiplied across ordinary days. Rituals migrate into public life not as doctrine but as practice. You keep refining simple prompts that can be taught in kitchens, classrooms, and community halls. Each new person who adopts a practice becomes a carrier who does not need your presence to sustain the effect. That diffusion comforts you because it means the work is not dependent on one voice but on many small steady hands. You rest with the satisfaction that patience and care, when practiced, create rhythms that outlast trends and mend what impatience once frayed. Stay available. Keep tending work. You wake into a narrow light that carries a tone you cannot ignore. Small things change around you, a ringtone ends mid-chime, a kettle hovers between whistles, footsteps slow on stairs. These shifts are subtle and persistent. They are not performances. They are the adjustments a world makes when a fresh cadence enters circulation. You learn to inhabit that cadence without disrupting it. The charge you carry grows clearer. Everyday acts require more care because what you release travels farther and meets real need. Wake times, meals, conversations, and brief silences turn into practices that preserve your ability to respond with clarity. Routine becomes protective architecture. Pressure increases from many directions. Platforms favor spectacle and push metrics that reward extremes. Critics amplify cynicism and mock testimonies. These forces test resolve. You respond by returning to basics, practicing repair, and favoring steadiness over flash. Community requests demand coordination. When neighborhoods seek help after conflict, you assemble small teams, listen longer than you speak, and design practices that locals can own. The aim is replication, not celebrity. Tools must travel into ordinary life without dependency on remote authorship. Accountability matters more than acclaim. Systems for feedback and correction are established. When error appears, you disclose steps to mend harm and invite affected people into the process. Transparent repair builds credibility and prevents single failures from undoing months of work. Personal rituals shift into shared rhythms. Others adopt breaths, pauses, and phrases. Informal leaders emerge who adapt the practices to local language and culture. Decentralization follows because the methods are portable and teachable. Local ownership becomes the primary sign of success. Fatigue tests limits. Sleepless nights and non-stop messages erode edges. You counter by institutionalizing rest, retreats, protected weekends, and quiet windows. Boundaries are not self-indulgent but fidelity toward those who depend on steady attention. Small acts reveal grace. A driver gives directions when you are lost. A stranger returns a forgotten object with a note saying "Stay well." A child repeats a phrase in a classroom. These modest events provide proximal evidence that small practices scale in ways metrics do not capture. Ethical complexity intensifies. Requests sometimes intersect politics and scarcity. You adopt principles to decline engagements that risk harm and partner with local actors who hold context knowledge. Delegation becomes an ethical choice when it increases safety and local agency. Listening becomes a core skill. Teams learn to hold space, ask questions that expose need, and return with summaries that honor those harmed. This prevents savior dynamics and nurtures mutual learning. Humility is method, not ornament. Public life demands clearer language. Messages are simplified into concrete steps so practices translate across cultures. Simplicity is sacred, it reduces misinterpretation and increases reproducibility. Tense moments call for steadiness. When rumors threaten to inflame, you model verification and patience. Measured response diffuses escalation and teaches communities to favor inquiry over reaction. Trust accumulates through repeated calm action. You learn to mark modest victories, repair relationships, classrooms that breathe easier, neighbors offering help. These outcomes matter more than viral spikes. You record them as proof that patient care yields durable change. Over time, the signal you steward transcends your person and attaches to practices others can carry. Leaders arise who teach and adapt. The work becomes an ecology rather than a single authorship. Decentralizing preserves continuity and lifts weight from one life. A clip now sits at the center of your view. It is concise and intent on practice. Watching is not passive, it is consent to participate. Tap the frame if you choose to help the next person find steadiness. The sequence continues through hands that will use it well. You sustain this work by cultivating practices that guard depth. Weekly solitude, shared meals with trusted friends, and slow deliberate walks preserve perspective. You calibrate language to reduce harm and design prompts that can be taught in living rooms and school halls. When you err, you repair quickly and openly, learning from missteps without spectacle. This posture of repair invites trust and models responsibility for others to emulate. The movement you tend multiplies when humility becomes practice, so ordinary people carry rituals into daily life. That a new clip sits central and concise. Tap to receive a set of practices that translate directly into steadiness. You stand before the screen and feel an invitation that asks for more than curiosity. Movement now matters because small acts travel farther than you imagined. Each deliberate pause, each measured breath, lands beyond the room and helps steady someone you will never meet. This work is modest in scale yet vast in consequence. It asks for patience and tiny repetitions, not spectacle. A single clip sits at the center of your view like a low door waiting to be opened. It offers a brief sequence of practices rather than entertainment. The instructions are direct and small: a breath to slow a racing chest, a phrase to soften a tense exchange, a moment of silence that invites listening. These tasks are designed so they can be used in kitchens, classrooms, and waiting rooms with no fanfare. You are asked to consent. Tapping the frame is not merely a click. It is an agreement to try a method and to pass it along. The intention is not to grow an audience but to cultivate steadiness. People who accept the invitation report subtle shifts: calmer evenings, easier conversations, children who fall asleep more readily. These changes are practical and accumulate with repetition. The invitation includes safeguards. Reminders, if enabled, arrive at quiet moments so prompts become practices instead of interruptions. Subscribing is suggested as a tool for habit, not as a pursuit of numbers. Notifications are framed as gentle nudges to practice rather than calls to consume. You are encouraged to set limits that preserve capacity. Public attention can bring pressure and misunderstanding. You learn to protect the fragile people who respond by creating simple follow-up systems and by delegating care to trusted partners. This work is decentralized. The methods travel because they are teachable and portable, not because one voice insists on being heard. The clip presents brief examples rather than extraordinary claims. It shows a family using a 2-minute pause to soften conflict, a teacher opening class with a breathing prompt that reduces restlessness, and a desk where a short phrase eases a tense conversation. The point is reproducibility. The practices fit into small pockets of time and can be taught to others. If you choose to engage, start with one small action now and one more tomorrow. Practice, then pass. Those two gestures form the architecture of durable change. Over weeks, small acts accumulate into habits that alter how people relate to one another. The work rewards steady fidelity more than dramatic outcomes. You are not asked to prove yourself or to be flawless. You are invited to be available and consistent. The clip offers modest accountability and tools for repair. When errors occur, the model emphasizes quick apology and correction. Transparency and repair build trust more reliably than image or rhetoric. Tapping the image is a choice to enter a field that privileges attention over applause. Subscribe only if you want reminders that support practice. Enable alerts only to receive timely prompts for care. These decisions tune your life so small habits can take root and spread. Now make the choice that matches the steadiness you have practiced. Tap the center frame, watch the brief sequence, try the first practice in the next hour, and pass it to someone who might need it. This is how ordinary days become places of repair, one small, repeated act at a time. The clip awaits. Touch it and continue the work. Small notes arrive that matter. A neighbor reports calmer evenings after trying a single prompt. A clinic worker describes a waiting room that breathed easier thanks to 2 quiet directions. These reports are not badges. They mark what modest habits do when repeated. You adapt by creating local practices that travel without dependency. Trusted friends triage messages and lead short gatherings where people practice steps aloud. This decentralization keeps the work resilient and limits harm from centralizing expectation on one person. You guard capacity by scheduling rest and curating requests. Boundaries become part of the method because they sustain responsiveness. Rest is stewardship. The clip in the center is concise. It demonstrates steps in homes, classrooms, and offices so you can use them immediately. If you tap, you will meet practical prompts and a clear model for passing them to one other person. Subscribing helps the rhythm stick. Alerts arrive in quiet moments and serve as reminders to practice, not as calls to consume. These options shape durable habits rather than chasing attention. Choose the step that matches the steady life you have built. Tap the image, watch the short sequence, try the first practice this hour, then pass it to someone who might need it. Subscribe only if you want gentle reminders, and enable notices to receive prompts at calm times. These small agreements keep the work alive and spread steadiness into ordinary days. Tap now and continue the practice. Keep going forward.